Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World, the podcast that celebrates the remarkable women of the Viking Age. From fierce warriors and powerful queens to wise seers and cunning goddesses, these women left an indelible mark on history. Join authors Johanna and K.S. each month as we explore the stories, achievements, and impact of Norse women. Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World. This is episode 31, in which Johanna and I talk to archaeologist Margrethe Havgar. I'm K.S. Barton, author of the Norse Family Trilogy, in which a young Viking woman and a Viking warrior are caught in a deadly blood feud between two brothers. And with me is Johanna Wittenberg. Hi, Johanna.
Hello. I'm Johanna I don't know who I am. I'm Johanna Wittenberg, author of the Norse Women series, which is a historical fantasy set in the early Viking Age, and it is inspired by the life of a real Norse queen, Queen Osa.
All right, so we are welcoming Margrethe Havgar. She is an archaeologist based in Oslo. She has more than 10 years of experience in disseminating archaeology, including in museums, at excavations, and online. Her main areas of interest include Scandinavian Iron Age art, Viking Age storytelling, and how history is both created and used in our current time. She's currently working on a PhD project focused on re-illustrating and reanalyzing the decorated textiles from the Oseberg burial in light of the rest of the art from the same burial. This project is part of the larger TexRec research project at the Museum of Cultural History of Oslo. She is also a co-host of the Nordic Mythology podcast with Daniel Farrand. Welcome, Margrethe.
Hi, you guys. Thanks for having me. I've been really excited about this.
Yeah, we can't wait to talk to you.
Let's go.
Wow.
Let's get into it.
Do we want to dig right in?
Yeah, let's do it.
So.
Okay.
So to start with, Margaret, maybe you can just give us a brief overview of the Oseberg burial, since some of our listeners might not know.
Yes, I think that's actually a really great place to start because for one, I either get way too into the nitty-gritty details or I expect that people don't know anything about it and I go too broad. So it's kind of hard to know sometimes. But the Oseberg burial is so named because it was discovered on a farm that is currently called Oseberg. So Oseberg, as far as we know, isn't necessarily a Viking Age name. It's named after the place where it was found in our modern day and age. That being said, modern depends on your definition because it was excavated in 1904. So it's a good, pushing 120 years. I don't do maths that well, so, give or take. But it's been a while since it was excavated, but it's pretty, I'd say it's both infamous and famous for the reason being that it is exceptionally well preserved, considering what we're being archaeologists unusual, I suppose. Archaeologists in general, I'm just counting all archaeologists into this. What we're used to finding from the Viking Age. So not only is stuff exceptionally well preserved, but materials that we don't necessarily usually find from the Viking Age, especially here in Norway, they're usually rotted away by the time we get to them. The reason being that here in Norway, in comparison to a lot of Denmark and Sweden, the soil for some reason is a tad bit more acidic here. So organic material like wood and leather and fabric and textiles, they usually rot away way quicker. But the Oseberg burial is full of stuff of wood, textiles, just it is a trip for anyone who's interested in the Viking Age. That being said, it's not like things are, pristine. Things were shattered, and there's stuff that we will get into later that is still fairly difficult, if not impossible, to figure out. But, it's a treasure trove, quite literally, also because it's easy to use Oseberg as kind of the quintessential example of the Viking Age, but that being said, I don't know if I'd say that the Oseberg burial is necessarily representative of the Viking Age at large, especially I think this is kind of what could we compare it to? King Tut It's like
Yeah.
it's on that level.
With less
So
gold.
yeah, yeah, less gold, less gold. True, true. Some gilded stuff, but not a lot of, hardware work. That's true.
And also it was the burial of two women.
Hmm.
Yes, that is an important factor to mention. And has been, a topic of some debate over the years. Not too much, thankfully, but there were two skeletons buried inside. Well, we assumed that they were inside what we term the burial chamber, which is essentially like a tent-like little house that was built atop the ship. Okay, I forgot to describe what the burial is actually like. Okay, so what we got here, the Oseberg burial is this big mound, meaning that they dug this pit and then they like constructed a mound around everything that was going to be in it. So I started the at the wrong end here, but essentially what they did was that they pulled a ship ashore and then they dug this little pit to put the ship in so it wouldn't tip over. Well, we assume that's why they did it. And then on the deck of the ship, they constructed this little house-like construction. And we know for a fact that that little chamber was not there when the ship was used to sail because it would just really mess up all like the weight and the balance of the ship. And then we assume that they put these two women inside, and then they filled this burial with a ton of stuff, including like four sleds and a wagon and 15 horses and two cows and six dogs and what potentially is like two cats and just a ton of fabric, especially within the burial chamber. And you have two beds, at least. What else have we got in here? We
And
got some
looms, they had looms.
looms, other textile working equipment. You got shoes, you got caskets, you got chairs, you got rods,
Cooking
that
equipment.
cooking equipment is
Uh,
just a bunch of stuff. And the thing with those Big that makes it particularly interesting is that so much of the stuff that was put in there was also heavily decorated. So the sleds, for example, 3 out of 4 sleds are just like carved from here till the moon. And it's not just that it's decorated, but like it is really well done. This is like top-notch work. This is like the Gucci of the Viking Age, I would say. Not everyone agrees with me on this, but like this is made by people who knew what they were doing. Oh, and buckets. I forgot about the buckets. There's so
Oh, the
many
Buddha
buckets.
bucket, of course.
hmm So named the Buddha bucket, so named because it has at the end of the handles where the handle is attached to the edge of the bucket, it has this like little human-like figurine on each end that is seated in a position that is very reminiscent of what we today would consider to be like a Buddha position. But this little figurine it's likely of insular origin, which in academic terms means like Ireland or the British Isles somewhere. So it probably has nothing to do with Buddha, but the name's kind of stuck.
Was it one of the Irish gods like Luke? Didn't he sit like that? Or was it somebody else? I thought there was
I have heard someone mention something along those lines. I am not very well versed in Irish mythology, so
there's
I'm going to be careful here, but
yeah, yeah, there's somebody who is
I
sitting
thought
kind
I'd
of
seen
like that
Camillus
in
sitting
like
like that at one point.
maybe that's who. Yeah, that's who it is. That's who it
Yeah,
is.
in a
I'm mistaken.
carving, or I'm not that
Or maybe it
familiar
was a
either, but
cauldron. Yeah, okay. Anyway.
yes, yes, it might have been.
yeah, well, I mean, the point being that, Buddha is not the only person who ever sat like that or has been pictured seated like that. So yeah, but where did I start? Yes, the women. So I say we assume the women were placed in the burial chamber because way before any archaeologist ever got to this mound, someone else got into it and had a heck of a time in there. So what we think is like probably around like the 950s, 970s AD, which means it's about 120 years after 120 to 140 years after the Oseberg burial, which has been dated to 834 AD. So Oseberg, 834. Someone else dug their way into the mound. We assume that they kind of knew what they were doing because the remnants of the trench was still there when it was excavated in 1904. And it seems like they've kind of like they haven't it's kind of almost like a straight path directly into the burial chamber. So the women were not found inside the burial chamber. They were found literally in bits and pieces in that what I call kind of the I like the Norse term for it, or at least the modernized Norwegian term for it, which is haugbrot, which like it's very easy to compare this or like call it a thievery or break-in, but to me, I'm unsure whether they were there to kind of steal things for economic gain. Like we don't know what the purpose of this kind of entry was. So the term haugbrot, which I like, it just means breaking the mound, just like entering the mound. So yeah, the women were dragged partially out, and that's
And
where we
parts of
found them.
them were taken away apparently, or disintegrated
Seemingly,
in the maybe disintegrated in the passage somehow.
yeah. We have two, so the two women, they are respectively in the oldest one, she's somewhere in her late 70s to mid 80s, and the youngest one is in her 50s, it seems. So, these were, women of a respectable age. And
Mhm.
we have most of the oldest woman and not that much of the younger one. For many reasons, which I can also sit here and talk about for a while, but they were reburied in the 1950s post-Holocaust, and the youngest woman was treated as a slave, which has been debunked later, and the way that she was buried could have contributed to bones going missing and blah, 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 blah. But that's another story for another time. I wrote a paper on that once and it was really interesting, but yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Mm.
So also there was magical, potentially magical equipment they think found in this grave.
Yeah, it's, okay. So here's where we get into the nitty-gritty, which I love. Because okay, so here's the thing. I wanna make it really clear from the get-go here that I am not necessarily anti anything, but sometimes I do think that certain interpretations have something has been proposed at some time and people have just run with it.
And
So
that's why
I've
it's nice to talk to somebody like you because what we get is what comes out that's
of
already been
course,
interpreted
yeah.
for us. So you can
And
tell us the basics.
yeah, so I also want to make it, people know this, but me being me, I also just want to say I am, of course, not representing the Museum of Cultural History when I talk about this. I'm representing me and my own opinions.
And that's why we have you here.
Yes. So, I mean, it's also when I say that people have run with it, I don't necessarily, I mean academics as much as anyone. Academics also, but I think it's really when you when you're trying to piece together the remnants of a culture that no longer exists, it's very seductive to put things that kind of don't necessarily make sense to you or don't have any obvious function to put it in a this has got to be like it's got to have something to do with like ritual or magic, and then you have Old Norse sources that talk about scythe, that the Norse like Old Norse type of magic thingy majig, which I love, to be honest. I love scythe. But yeah, it's I mean the I'm kind of curious also if you have specific items in mind, because I don't want to put words in
Well,
your mouth. Are you talking about the rods?
there's one thing that people have surmised might be a magic wand, a staff, a sorceress staff. And there's one that has some enigmatic runes on it. And
Hmm.
I believe was there a pouch with cannabis in it? Or am I getting
There
that mixed up with another?
no,
Yeah.
you're correct. We haven't uh ooh, I might be off about this, but I know that there's a botanist at the Natural History Museum here in Oslo who she was looking into the cannabis seeds. And last I talked to her, but that's like pushing a few years now. But at that point, it hadn't been determined whether or not they were seeds used for just like the hemp plant or whether
I
they
was
were
just thinking that, yeah.
actual like the drug inducing cannabis. So
But let's talk
Uh,
about the staffs
yeah,
because they're
the
very
staff.
interesting.
Yeah. That being said, I'm not, I'm not an expert on the staff, but I think the staff is pretty cool. It is really interesting, and it has been determined as this vulva staff. So when I say vulva, I'm not talking about genitals. I'm talking about the
Yes.
specific women's, often determined as a women's role, being like being able to talk to, you know, other powers or communing with the dead or that kind of thing. It's
Seeing the future.
easy to, yeah, see risks or
And the word,
sort of.
the term actually means staff bearer or wand bearer, correct? That's what I've
As far as I'm
seen.
aware, I've heard that mentioned.
Yes, I've read it a few times, so
Hmm. Which is interesting. So maybe like calling it like a vulva staff becomes kind of like a River
redundancy.
Avalon situation.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's I mean, here's the thing. I'm not like I'm not against it being a wand type thing, but I've worked with interpreting and like analyzing the Oseberg burial. And also like what I started with was disseminating it. I worked as a guide at the museum for 8 years. And what really intrigues me about kind of the research history of the burial is that it started out being kind of very functionalistic interpretations of the early 1900s, which is very common. So everything was like everything had to have some sort of practical purpose, and if it didn't have a practical purpose, it was just kind of noted, and then we moved on a little bit. I'm generalizing heavily here. But then kind of in as we approach like the 80s and the 90s and also especially the early noughts, what I really like is that other types of interpretations are considered. But what we end up in then is like either you have this, what I would classify as like this functionalistic interpretation of the burial having to uh, have been for a queen or queens, because why else would two women have this burial? But and then on the other hand, you have the alternative of, oh, either one or both have to have been like a vulva because why else? But then you end up again in this, why else would these two women have gotten such an extravagant burial? And I'm not really against either, but I'm a bit in the group of, but what else could it have? Like what why there
Why else
must
would?
have been other types of ex like you don't have to like shoehorn everything into like one of these two boxes. Couldn't they just have been women who were important?
Well, and we've
Period.
we've got Gunhild, who, she was both a queen and a sorceress.
There you go. Exactly.
She was
So,
pretty much a historic figure.
Yep.
so what is it about the staffs, the rods that makes people think they might be magic or like magic wands? Are there runes on it?
Oh,
Are they shaped in a certain way? Are they designed
And
in a
there's
certain
two
way?
different ones, and one is like too big to really be a magic wand, right?
I think well,
And
here's
that's
the
the
thing.
one that has the runes on it. And then
Yeah.
there's another one that is just carved, right? Am I
Is
remembering
that
this?
the one with a little dog head thing on it?
No,
No, okay.
that's another one. There's
Yeah.
a lot of mysterious equipment in
Okay.
this burial.
Yes, there is. There really, really is. And I, oh my gosh, this is what I love and hate about doing, talking about Oseberg because there is just so much stuff in the burial. So when we get into like the nitty-gritty that isn't the stuff that I've been looking at for the past week, I'm like, oh crap. Uh,
Well, listen,
which
why don't
artifact was
we,
this?
now that you've given us an overview, why don't we go ahead and get into, you're starting with your master's thesis about the gripping creatures on a sailing wind horse, which I love that
Yes.
title.
Yeah,
That's,
that's
Thank
great.
you. Thank you
I
so much.
rescued you.
I
It's
was very
very,
That is a
pleased
very
with it.
Norse
fabulous title.
poet. You're a skald with your language.
Yes, very
Can I
much.
tell you guys something? I've always had so much fun putting together titles that remember for one of my courses during my master's I we were doing drafts of papers, and I don't remember what it was now, but I made some sort of pun in the title that was relevant to my topic, but that was also somehow attached to like the zeitgeist of the time. This was like a few years ago, so uh I think it was maybe something related to Game of Thrones or something, but then what happened was that everyone else in the course started doing the same and the lecturers started to lose their minds. And I was like, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, but I love composing titles. So thank you so much. I'm
That's a
gonna hold on
wonderful
to
one.
that for a while. But yes, go ahead. That was kind of my first um I remember I'd been working as a guide at the Viking Ship Museum here in Oslo for a few years, and I was going to do my master's thesis, and I was kind of complaining at a party to a friend, be like, "Oh, I really just want to write about the ship," because that was kind of my first love was the Oseberg ship specifically. I was like, "The ship is just so beautiful. And I just want to write about the art, but like, there's nothing else to write about it. Everyone's done everything." And this friend of mine at the time just kind of looked at me and went, "But have you checked though?" And I was like, "Wait, maybe I haven't. I just kind of assumed." And so I checked. It turned out the kind of stuff that I wanted to write about hadn't been written about it. So, yay me!
Nice.
Yay.
And yay to the friend who said, "Have you checked?"
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. That was a good piece of advice.
Hmm.
Hmm. Very much so. So please, please ask questions because I could go in very many directions about this. What do you want to talk about? Because there's a lot to get into here.
So, what are the gripping creatures?
So what I what I kind of used as my focal point was interpreting the art on the ship and comparing it to a couple of other items from the burial with the same style because although there is a lot of decorated artistic things in the burial like we've talked about, it is not of the same art style. It's kind of like if you go into, I don't know, National Portrait Gallery or the Louvre, not everything is, cubism in this to kind of put it in a general term, like in general terms. But so I compared it to a couple of other things from the burial, and then I also pulled in a sword from northern Norway and a couple of bridal fittings from a place called Broa in Sweden, which also are of the same style. And what's kind of particular about this style, not just this style, but this is like the first instance where we start to see what I call gripping creatures. They're often referred to as gripping beasts, but
Hmm.
I decided to call them creatures because I feel like even though I haven't studied linguistics, I'm very into like words and what we mean when we use certain words. And to me, beast always sounds kind of like big and ferocious and kind of like aggressive or something kind of potentially dangerous. And the thing is, these gripping creatures could very well be that because in many cases they are literally gripping each other's throats, like they're choking each
Yeah.
other out. But a lot of them also like kind of look like little teddy bears. I'm not gonna lie. So yeah, that's why I went with gripping creatures instead of gripping beasts. And what I thought was really interesting was essentially what I started to notice was that some of them are kind of face forward, almost like they're looking you full in the face, while
Hmm.
others were kind of glancing out to the side or in profile, meaning that you could only see one half of their face. So I kind of stumbled on that, and I was like, wait, is there a pattern here? Like depending on where it is on the different objects that I'm analyzing. And I kind of ended up with this conclusion where I kind of mused whether or not these gripping creatures were kind of keeping watch in a way. Because on the ship, they are exclusively looking to the side, almost like they're looking across the sides of the ships lengthwise. While on the inside of the ship, there are a couple of instances of gripping creatures where they're facing in towards the deck. Like if you were standing on deck, they would be looking down at you. But these ones were looking you full in the face. They were enfas, as we say. And then I started comparing that to the other artifacts, and that's when I ended up with that conclusion that maybe they're kind of they're lookouts in a way.
Yeah, what a thought.
Hmm.
Yeah. And
I thought that was
so,
interesting.
Like gargoyles,
In a way, or like
kind of
there's
protecting.
some, yeah, some sort of like I don't know whether I mean this like in a magical sense or whether it's just kind of like the vibe of there always being someone there to watch over you, like just kind of the cultural norm of like you will be watched if you try to, excuse my French, like around. Like people will see you, whether it is what we would think of as a thing, but maybe this thing is considered more than a thing because it has depictions on it. So maybe the depictions themselves are actually alive in a weird way.
well,
Hmm.
and they did believe in the Alfar and also the Vetter, the whites. And so I wonder
Spirits.
if these are representative of those,
That's a good
as
question.
lookouts. Like
Yeah.
they're maybe invoking these invisible creatures because they were mostly friendly, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean they
Didn't want to make them
absolutely could
mad,
be.
but
No, yeah, exactly. So it's like it's kind of it's kind of like you could come like my sense of it, even though I don't think I kind of stated that specifically, but my kind of feeling of them is kind of like guard dogs, not in the way that we think dog, but like if you know the dog won't attack you. But if
hmm,
you are not supposed to be there, then mm, like watch out.
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense. Yeah, and in the sagas and different literature, you hear them talk about the land wights and these unseen creatures that have to do with your Hamingia and all that. I mean, they're I think I'm thinking about Eagle's saga
Yeah, I was just
where
thinking of Eagle.
yeah, where
Yeah.
he cursed Gunhild and and set the horse head on the post and
Hmm.
anyway,
Facing in towards the
facing in
people.
and they were driven from Norway supposedly because of this and according
Yeah.
to the saga.
Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of what I it's interesting like with those saga comparisons also because I mean, regardless of what we can actually pin down, it's clear that the way that the people of the Viking Age interacted with their world was dramatically different from ours today. You know,
Hmm.
Yes.
which is true for I would assume pretty much all cultures globally at that time because it is like 1200 years ago. So, you know, it's safe
Yeah.
to assume I would say that things have changed. But it's then interesting to kind of try to get a glimpse of, but what does that mean exactly?
Yeah,
Um,
there's so many mysteries.
yeah, and I'm very intrigued by this notion of it. I think it comes up in a couple of I don't remember if it's like the sagas at the moment or whether it's in the poetic Edda or Snorri's Edda, but this notion of to us like things we kind of approach things as being dead in a way. Or like a thing is just a thing, right? But now when I say we, I also kind of broadly refer to kind of West Europe, West Northern European, and North America, that type of like our that kind of like in quotation marks Western point of view. But I'm really intrigued by this notion of not only that a thing is more than a thing, but also the concept of as soon as you carve or forge or cast or weave some sort of a creature or depiction or humanoid or something into it, that isn't just a depiction, but it becomes part of the object. So the object actually is part of what it shows. That like the cultural annotations, whatever you kind of associate with, let's say, a bird. If there's a bird on that comb, there are aspects of the bird in that comb. The comb
Hmm.
isn't just a comb. It has a bird like there is like some sort of birdness to it.
Birdness, I
Hmm.
like that.
Yeah.
So I know that, there were multiple different artists that worked on the Oseberg burial, not just the ship,
Hmm.
but the burial. And so were there different artists that worked on the ship, or are the carvings all one artist? Or is that unknown?
I mean,
Or one style, maybe, is a
You mean
better.
on the back then on the ship itself? Is that
yeah,
what you're talking? Okay,
the
okay.
ship itself seems to be the ship itself is one style. And although I'm not necessarily an expert at
The
determining,
ship itself has carvings, on it.
yeah, yeah, exactly. The ship has carvings on the outside on both sides, both starboard and port, and also um uh both aft and prow. So both side, like four sides, it has carvings going from all the way at the top down to below the waterline. But it seems to be, as far as I can tell, no study has been done of this, but one person. Or at least it seems to have been kind of one. There aren't any indications of there being dramatic changes in the style that would lead us to believe that I don't know if I would say that it was one artist because it could have been, a team of craftspeople. Yeah,
A
but that,
team.
they were all working within the same style.
Okay. And
Uh,
so then, but some of the other items like the sledges and the cart is definitely a different time period I and everything else, right?
The sled is extremely not the sled, the wagon. The wagon is extremely interesting because it's extremely atypical, and I've read the earliest interpretations of it, and they kind of didn't know what to do with it. They were like, what are we looking at? But there's a really interesting chapter in the book The Norse Sorceress, which you might have read.
Hmm.
It came out a couple years ago. Yeah, by oh, what's his full name? Luciano. Da, 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 da. I know him. I'm so sorry, Luciano, that I can't remember your last name.
I hate it when my mind goes blank.
He's been on the
Right?
podcast, your podcast, hasn't he?
Yes, he's been
Multiple
last like
times?
less than a week ago. Luciano Pizzoli wrote a really interesting take that this might actually have been carved by non-native people from like people who weren't natively from Scandinavia that are trying to emulate a style that they are around, but that they are using their own knowledge of crafts and carving and kind of putting using their artistic language to try to portray a Viking Age Scandinavian story, which I found really interesting. And he has a lot of really good comparisons with art found in what is currently Siberia. That it might have been this kind of northeastern type of influence on it, which would quite genuinely, I haven't looked into this specifically myself, but that would solve a lot of problems and questions about the wagon and the burial because it is an outlier by far artistically. It's weird.
Well,
It's really well
it's also
made.
older than the ship too, right?
It's
Or
it's sure it's I can't quite remember exactly what the dating is for it. So the ship is from about at least 14 years before the burial. So it's been used for a little more than a decade. I'm actually unsure when exactly the wagon is dated to, but when it comes to dating things in the burial, it's also really hard to place stuff because you're really, really dependent on the preservation of the artifact in question. And also, the thing
mm,
is that when we're talking about specifically carbon dating stuff, so what's also referred to as C14, you're reliant on these kind of curvature graphs. And the thing is that this specific, so typical, but this specific time period in Scandinavia, there is like there are so many outliers on the graphs that it can be hard to pinpoint exactly when stuff is
um,
from. So the thing with C14 dates is that if you get a really, really good date, it's like plus minus a couple of years maybe. So you always get like that little plus minus, but then
it's always a range.
there's always a range. But in the case of the Oseberg, especially when stuff in the Viking Age, if you end up with with a date that's like plus minus 200 years, then you're a bit like, well, okay. Then okay, what do we do with this? Because then that might be way before the Viking Age, you might be at the end of the Viking Age, who knows? Um, so yeah, it's a bit difficult.
Yeah, very interesting though. Okay, so you were talking about the comb and how if you put a bird on the comb, then the comb acquires birdness, right? So how would that apply to the ship itself?
It's a good question. That is a good question. And I'm gonna have to say I don't know other than I am intrigued by the idea that the ship might be considered a creature in and of itself. And that's where the sailing wind horse comes into play of my title, Gripping Creatures on a Sailing Wind Horse. And that's not to say that I think that the ship is a horse. That's not at all what I'm saying. But you have these poetic phrasings from written sources about the Viking Age called kennings, which are like poetic phrasings used to talk about something else. It's not exactly a metaphor, but you can kind of call it a metaphor. But I think a couple of linguists will argue with that on that front. But anyway, so a kenning for a ship or ships is sailing wind horse. So by that, I don't mean that ships are equivalent, like a ship is a horse, but it's more like, okay, well then if it's a sailing wind horse, what does that mean? What does a horse mean? What are kind of the ideas about horses? And I started to dig into this, and it seems like there was this notion that horses had the ability to kind of cross certain borders that humans otherwise couldn't cross. Like they could move between, I call them spheres. So like spheres of being or spheres of reality. So the easy comparison here in a Viking Age sense is, Midgard, Utgard, Osgard, you know, the
Like
three different realms of
Yggdrasil,
Midgard.
like Yggdrasil
Yeah, exactly.
means
So
Odin's steed, right?
yeah. So my thought then was, okay, well, if a kenning for ship is sailing wind horse, and these are all features of a horse, does that mean then that they consider that ships have equal kind of abilities to that of an actual alive horse? Does a ship then have the ability to transcend and kind of pass through all these borders in kind of the same way? All of that to say, since you asked me what does that mean for the ship with the creatures and everything, I don't know what creature the ship would be, but I do think that there is an argument to be made that the ship could be considered a creature, is my thought. But that's also really interesting because I think it's very it's a very instinctual thing for us as soon as we talk about, art and we're trying to look at art and understand it too. As soon as we see something that is definitely alive and is definitely a creature, but not necessarily human, that we try to categorize it. But when it comes to animal art, especially Viking Age animal art, I think that sometimes that is absolutely possible to do. Sometimes it's obviously a bird or a snake of some kind, or a horse. A lot of horses around. But other times, particularly with the Oseberg ship itself, it's almost like the creatures there aren't based in reality at all. They seem to be their own thing. So I've
Mm.
seen them interpreted a lot of ways, but to me, it's not really interesting to try to put them into a category of being. But I'm like, it is a creature of some sort, and that is enough.
So the figurehead on the Oseberg ship it looks like a serpent head, right? A
Hmm.
snake head.
Hmm.
And
That
so
was
would
pretty
that,
common though, wasn't it?
Okay, okay. So here's the thing. We are led to believe so, based on, I mean, from some sagas, you get the impression that figureheads on Viking ships were not uncommon. And there are other, for example, the Gotlandic picture stones also give the indication of at least there being some sort of decoration where the figurehead would be, some sort of, I call them like cinnamon buns because that's kind of what they look like. Little swirlies. But the Oseberg ship is the only ship we've found with a figurehead. It is the only actual ship with a figurehead in the world.
Wow.
Yep.
I
Did
didn't know
not know
that.
that.
But I
Interesting.
Wow.
mean, and it went to the lengths that at a certain point in time, in like I think it was the 50s or something. I might be wrong about this, so don't quote me on it, even though we're recording a podcast episode. But someone at the Viking Ship Museum actually had someone make a figurehead for the Goksta ship, which is one of the other three that is on
Right.
display there, and mounted it on the Goksta ship because they felt kind of bad about the fact that there wasn't a figurehead on it, even though the Goksta ship absolutely did not have one.
Poor ship. That's hilarious.
I wonder if they
So,
buried them without the figurehead for a reason. Like all the stories talk about them taking the figureheads off if they're going home or if they're not being aggressive. I wonder if there was some kind of like superstitious reason why they wouldn't bury it with the figurehead.
that's true.
About that, here's the thing. That implies that the figureheads were detachable in
Well,
some way. But
yeah.
as far as I can tell, that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case with Oseberg. It seems to have just kind of gone in, like been, not necessarily like a piece of IKEA furniture that you would easily take apart and put back up again. And there are no indicators that there has ever been a figurehead on the Goksta ship. And
Oh.
these are the only two Viking ships in the world that there are enough left of for us to say anything of the fact because the Skuldelev ships and the Roskilde ships in Denmark and the Myklebust ship in southeastern Norway and the Yellowstone ship which I helped excavate in 2020 we have the bottom part but we don't have the top part so we don't know what the top part looked like.
Mm. Hmm.
Right. That's interesting.
Hmm.
Um, and the figurehead on the Oseberg ship is not really so much a figurehead as it is just the end of the end of the stem. And it's just carved in kind of a fanciful way, but it's not, it's not facing forward. It doesn't look ferocious. It's not like a
It's
beast.
not what we assume a figurehead would look like.
Yeah, yeah, not at all.
You know what's
So,
really interesting about that? Sorry, I
but
cut you off. Please go
no,
ahead.
no, I just,
But when we think about like the figureheads of Viking ships, I mean, I'm gonna have to double check this, but I am fairly convinced that the figureheads that we think of originate with the 19th century illustrations of the sagas that were published in Scandinavia.
Oh, so another thing that we have to take the Victorians to task for.
yes.
Yeah, or
But,
I
but
would say I would say national romantics of Norway and Sweden probably, because there was a lot of nation building going on at the time, and they were
Mm,
using the Viking Age for all it was worth. Because
yeah.
but
the
there
thing
is,
is, like contemporaneous depictions that we have of ships that could potentially have figureheads, meaning decorated end of the prows, is what I
Mm,
right,
mean by saying
right,
that.
right.
hmm
Um, are as far as I'm aware, the Gotlandic picture stones from Gotland in Sweden, and they have those little cinnamon bun swirly thingies. So we have no
Right.
contemporaneous sources that I know of. I want to stress that I know of that show a figurehead in the sense that we would expect it to be like a head looking outward. There are no actual examples of that from the Viking Age itself, as far as I know.
We just have the mention in, and I don't remember the source, but there's one mention of saying, take your figurehead down so that you don't scare the land whites. And I don't even remember where that mention is.
Yeah, I don't either.
But then it's not necessarily described, right? It could have been a
Right.
swirly cinnamon
It's
bun.
not.
It's pretty cool. It's a little fun fact for you.
Yes, I'm learning so much already. Great. So I am really curious about, the animal head posts. And maybe you could talk a little bit about them because they're so amazing and nobody really knows what they were for, correct?
Nope. Nope, we don't. It's kind of hard to, I mean, it's so the animal head posts are these, it's exactly what they sound like. They are posts that are animal heads. Like the entire post is carved into very distinctly, like they're very, what can I, how can,
They
they are
look like
very
monsters.
themselves.
They look like monsters or dragon heads.
Yeah, monsters are dragon heads, but they're not copies of each other either.
No, no.
They're all very distinctive. Like I have this photo series of me from like 10 years ago or something where I like stand next to each of the display case and I try to imitate the facial features. They're really funny. And they're all also interestingly, as far as I know, they're all different substyles of animal art. They're not the same styles. So these
So
seems to have
different.
come from perhaps different workshops or perhaps different artisans have made. Perhaps they're also from different points of time. Might also be. There were originally five, but one was unfortunately lost. It was heavily broken into pieces by the time that it was excavated, and it was almost impossible to assemble. But there was a reconstruction made based on the little bits and pieces. It was literally like a jigsaw puzzle. It was just very difficult. But unfortunately, they were put in like a preservative bath, and unfortunately, it kind of the fifth one kind of dissolved.
No.
No.
Which was I've
Whoops.
talked to yeah, it's like I talked to a colleague of mine about it who he's an expert. He's the head of the collection of the Viking Ship Museum, Jan Bill, fabulous researcher. And we talked about this on a another episode we did about a year ago, and he said, "Yeah, we don't really like to talk about it because it's embarrassing." So there were
Tragic.
originally five, but they were kind of found in odd places too. But at the same time, it's putting they were found inside the burial chamber inside of the ship, but piecing together exactly what the burial chamber looked like is a difficult task because these people that made their way into the burial like 120 to 140 years post burial really were not gentle about it. They kind of they went a bit they were rough in their handling of stuff. So things are really just strewn around. But they're found in different corners of the burial chambers. So a an interpretation is that the animal head posts were potentially kind of arranged around that there would have been a bed or two beds inside the burial chamber on which the two women were placed, and that these five animal heads were kind of put around the bed, and that there was then a rope that was put through their mouths because the animal heads all have gaping mouths except like their canines, if you can call them that, are touching. So it's kind of like a very
Oh,
big
like a
sewing
loop.
needle. Yeah.
Hmm.
Hmm.
So it's like an idea is that potentially these were used as kind of like a barrier between the women and potential visitors to the burial before the mound was constructed and closed because there are also scientific indicators that only half of the mound was constructed at first and that they left it open for about potentially like a 6 month period, potentially so that people could come from afar and visit the burial before they closed it completely. And perhaps then these animal head posts were used as some sort of like a stop here.
Well, they when they were having their duels, they
That's
always
what I was
had
thinking of.
sacred bands, and the same way with when they had the at the Ting, they had sacred bands that were, they had posts and ropes, and then that was a sacred space.
Yep.
That's very common in
Yeah.
magic and religious ceremonies to mark this the space, a circle or a square or whatever. But
Well, and if these were very powerful women, then it might have also been partly for the protection of the viewers, the people who were.
100%. And it could
Yeah.
also mark like if they were used in that way, it could also be like an indicator of beyond this edge is like the realm of the dead. Like dead beyond here, alive on the other side. So like
Yes,
do not cross.
That makes a lot of sense to me.
Hmm. So that is one interpretation. Other than that, it's kind of hard to know exactly what they were used for. They're hollow on the inside. We know that. And they also seem to have, many of them seem to have this sort of like handle thing sticking out at the back end, all the way at the bottom. So they
Mm.
could potentially have been carried. That is also a thing that people have just really run with like
Mhm.
that. But they, I mean, they could potentially have been used like processions or, to just be easily handled, essentially.
Sure,
Um,
sure.
Possibly for
I
balance.
love
I
them.
don't know. They're so cool.
They
They're
are.
awesome.
They really are.
I
Hmm.
can like imagine it like maybe some kind of like a priestess or some kind of all
Hmm.
decked out and when their robes or whatever carrying these things to the burial mound and
Hmm.
but that's my writer mind getting ahead of me.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
at the same
my
time,
imagination just goes crazy with things like that. Like, especially there are a couple of sagas where they talk about a king going into the mound while he's still alive with his followers. And so I'm thinking about the Oseberg burial, and there's food in there. There's a partial tapestry that, wasn't finished. I mean, there's so many things that would keep them entertained while they're in the mound. Whether,
hmm,
whether they were really alive or whether they were imagined as alive, it's so interesting.
it really is, and that's the fun thing, with this kind of stuff from the Viking Age too, is that like one thing is if you're a researcher like me, but another thing is when you're using your creative endeavors like you guys do, is like you can really just there's so much to be done with this because also from like the little that we do know, like the only contemporaneous source that we have, which is, heavily discussed, but I'm sure you're familiar with Ibn Fadlan.
Of
Oh yeah.
course.
Yes. And his description of a burial, and if that in fact is a description of a contemporaneous Viking Age burial, I'm not going to go into this, listeners. If you're, are interested in Ibn Fadlan, go check him out. It is very much R-rated.
Yeah.
But it
Yes.
gives you a bit of an indication of what a Viking Age burial potentially could be like. And the reason that it's used so much is that a lot of the stuff that he says tracks with these big ass mounds that we find and everything that's
Yeah.
inside there. And it doesn't seem to have been kind of like, okay, they're dead, we're gonna, give them this nice burial and then we're gonna close it and it's done. Like it seemed to be something that was prolonged, had a lot of probably ceremony and rituals and tons of people were involved. So it's kind of, yeah, let your imagination just kind of run amok with it.
It's very fun.
It is
Good
a
food
lot of
for thought.
fun.
And when you mentioned King Tut earlier, that also makes me think of the Egyptian burials when they built the pyramids. Even though I know these burials weren't nearly as grand as a pyramid, but it seemed like all the accoutrements that went with these two women seemed to be similar to what maybe some of the pharaohs or some of those people were buried with. The
Hmm.
sled and the wagon and the animals and the food and the cooking
And the
equipment
beds.
and the beds and everything that goes with them. It seems very similar to me.
Yeah, it truly is decked out. I mean, I think the most interesting kind of comparison, and this probably also, I'm not an Egyptologist, so please don't come at me, Egyptologist, if I get this wrong. But what I think is really interesting is that it's hard to know in the Scandinavian sense whether these things that were put in the burial were specifically made for the burial or not. That's when we come back to like that dating issue,
Yeah.
right? So it's hard to know, but it's very possible that some things were made for the burial, but it's also really possible that these are things that for some reason were included. Maybe they're heirlooms, maybe it's a thing where people kind of give important or well-made, expensive items as sort of like an offering or a sacrifice. Like who knows why all these things were placed there, and
Right.
who knows
Right.
why? But it's so fun that they're there because it literally is a time capsule. It's literally a time capsule,
Yes.
and it's so
It
Mhm.
fun.
really
And
is.
but I also think, KS, that thinking about the pyramids isn't such a far-fetched idea because similarly to the pyramids, one thing is the interior of the burial, but another thing is just the mere presence of, a pyramid construction and a
Oh yeah.
mound construction is that
Mm-hmm.
they were, landscape wise, just thinking spatially and topographically, they were built to be seen. You were supposed to know that they were there.
Mhm.
It is like it's
Yeah.
a very
It's a monument.
conscious choice. It's a monument. It literally is a
Mm-hmm.
monument. We don't know exactly why or what the thought was there, but we know for sure that it was meant to be seen, because if it wasn't meant to be seen, they'd probably done it a different way.
Right.
Well, didn't BJ 581 have a big mound with a big rock on top of it? Or in front of it? Wait, is
It
that
was
right?
covered with a huge rock, I
It's covered
believe.
with a huge rock. Yeah.
It's
That's what I remember.
absolutely possible. I can't tell you for sure if that is correct in this case, but that absolutely tracks. And there are a ton of mounds with absolutely nothing inside them. There are a ton of mountains with just. There are some that are built over just like empty house constructions, like longhouse constructions. There are chamber burials. There are cairns. There are so many variations. It's like pick your favorite type burial.
Speaking of the contents of the mound and of the ship, can you tell us about the Oseberg tapestries, which is your current PhD project?
Yes. Ooh, and we're really getting into the juicy stuff.
Hmm.
So, besides like all the other stuff that we've talked about that make the Oseberg just like an insanely amazing find, there is the tapestries is another thing that makes this burial fairly unique in a Viking Age sense. That is not to say that there were not textiles or tapestries of the same type or quality in other burials, but the Oseberg burial is the only one with the amount of preserved tapestries and textiles that have currently been found. We don't have another collection to compare it to. We only have bits and pieces from there are some from Valsier in Sweden, but those are also a bit pre-Viking Age, but like they're not nearly enough that are preserved to the same extent that the Oseberg tapestries are. And I also want to make a bit of a kind of a disclaimer here that it something that I actually learned myself when I started working on this project was that when we say Oseberg tapestries, that's why I switch between textiles and tapestries a lot. Um, Tapestry in this specific instance is a technical term in like which describes the way that this like woven picture or woven piece of fabric has been made. It is a technical weaving term. It does not specifically mean something that has been hung on a wall. And that is a very interesting and very important distinction to make because we do not know if any of these textiles were hung on walls. And my supervisor for my PhD project, Marianne Federer, has also done a really interesting study where she studied the burial chamber. She went through it and she found absolutely no indicators of anything that would prove or show that these textiles had been hung at least inside the burial. There's nothing on the ceiling or the walls of the burial chamber that indicate any type of like mounds or fastenings for these pieces of fabric. What does that mean? Oh, good question. But it means that these fabrics could have been used for literally anything. They could have been, they could have been bed sheets, they could have been pillow covers, they could have been maybe even carpets. Now, not everyone agrees with me on this, and I don't even know if I agree with myself. I'm just trying to keep my options open. We don't really know what these pieces of fabric were used for, but what we know is that they are exquisitely made. They are extremely broken up. They are hard to puzzle together, and they are beautiful in what they show. But they're also just speaking from a personal point of view here, after having sat and worked on my re-illustrations for the past workday before this, prior to this episode, they so frustrating. Not because the tapestries themselves are frustrating, but because of the the decomp or decomposition. Just they're 1,200
Yeah,
years old at least. And
yeah,
so some of them are frayed. They're an important thing to mention here also, which I found really interesting when I was getting into this project, was just the research history of it, because these these textile pieces were also found in 1904, meaning they were found any kind of prior to the technological revolution of how do we care for textiles. When they found
right.
them, they literally did not know how do we preserve them. So it was really touch and go for a long time. And I mean that as a huge compliment to the archaeologists and conservators of the time, because the fact that they managed to even preserve them for me to look at them 120 years later is, a feat, I would say.
Absolutely.
But that also comes with its own set of challenges, because it's hard to know exactly what was done, because different people took different types of notes, and not everything has been digitized, and some, not every you have to go to museum archives. And the biggest thing for me at the moment is that they, for some reason, considering that this burial was excavated in 1904, the documentation is pretty exquisite. It's a very well documented excavation, except when it comes to the fabrics. For some reason, they did not specify where the different pieces were found. We just know
Huh.
that all the tapestry pieces are from inside the burial chamber, period. So I
Ugh.
don't know, and there are some, like, I have to go through the Gabriel Gustafsson, the field manager or excavation manager's field notes again, his diaries, which are extremely interesting, and very fun. But like there are notes of like, oh, we opened a casket inside of which there were decorated fabrics, and I'm like, but which ones? Which ones? Gabriel, come on, give me a break. But they're really magnificent. So, in the introduction, you mentioned that my PhD project is about re-illustrating and reanalyzing these fabrics, and so my thought was really just to kind of look at them, and I knew that there were a lot of brilliant drawings made by especially two extremely talented illustrators and artists from the early 1900s and mid 1900s, Sophie Kraft and Mary Storm, respectively. And I was like, I'm just going to use that and go with that. Because the thing is that I can kind of preface this, I guess, by just giving a bit of a look into why I'm doing what I'm doing. And that is that my PhD project is a part of a larger research project called TextRec, which is an extremely multidisciplinary research project that is funded by the Norwegian Research Council, which aims to pretty much reanalyze everything about these fabrics because they're so unique in the sense and the context that they're found in. Because like you mentioned Gunhild earlier, and we have different saga literature where tapestries and like weaving especially is heavily featured. They talk about this a lot, but besides those mentions, we don't really have that much. Like archaeologically speaking, it's hard to trace because it just isn't preserved. So that's why this find is kind of bonkers. And what TextRec as a whole project aims to do is to reanalyze these all of the fabrics really, because they're not just tapestries, they're also what are
Right.
called like functional fabrics, maybe like fabrics that weren't necessarily meant to look pretty but that were functional in some sort of other way,
Mhm.
and try to apply types of analyses that previously we haven't been able to do because technology has evolved so quickly during the last 120 years. So I'm actually one of two archaeologists on this massive project. And there are chemists, there are botanists, there are conservators, there are computer engineers. There's so many different people involved in this project, doing everything from like dye analyses to preservation experiments to pretty much anything like trying to digitally reassemble them. Like there's so much going on. And my tiny teeny little part of that project is like, what did they mean?
Well, that's the most interesting part
Yeah, it is.
to us, of
Yeah,
course.
so what I mentioned earlier was that, I thought that I had all I needed. Let's just put it that way. Um like, oh great, they've taken so many high-res images, so high resolution images, like 4K images taken in 2022 by a brilliant photographer by the name of Alexis Pontos at the museum. They'd made these like light models, which means that you can plug them into the specific software called RTI, and like you can play with the lighting and look at. I'm like, oh great. And then I also have all of these wonderful illustrations from like 1916 and 1950 to look at. And then I started to compare the pictures from 2022 to the drawings. And first of all, some of the drawings, I was like, I don't know if I necessarily agree with what I'm looking at. And then I kind of looked at the picture of the actual piece of fabric and I was like, what?
Hmm.
Not that the drawings didn't necessarily match, but I was like, I literally can't tell where on the fabric this is. Because it's changed. It's continued to decompose, or things have changed within the fabric. It's continued to fray, that kind of stuff. And it also turned out that a lot of the fragments that I wanted to analyze hadn't been illustrated.
I was just going to ask you that because one of the pictures you sent me, I see that it looks like I've never seen it before.
Mm. Which one is that?
It's the one that has the horse that, remember, I emailed you and said it looked like there
Mm.
were three people riding on this horse.
Yep.
I've never seen it, I swear.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I also thought that one hadn't been illustrated. Found out it has been, but it's just the image has been like the picture's just kind of been buried in the archive.
Yeah.
Just because that happens sometimes.
Yeah.
But it exists, but not all of them had been illustrated. So I was like, oh crap, then what do I do? And my supervisor just kind of not really in relation to that, but in relation to something else, just kind of offhand mentioned to me. She was like, "Well, I mean, I guess we could try to like just draw like on our computers, like with our cursors. I guess we could just try to sketch what we see." Uh,
Wow.
and I was like, and it's fun to talk about now because my initial reaction was like, "Nah, I don't know." That's not what I said, but like internal, I was like, well, maybe. But then internally, I was like, that I don't know about that. But then at the time, I had this personal laptop that is also a touchscreen with a pen, like that has like a digital pen. Like, huh? I wonder. And then I started just kind of like playing around, trying to look into like what software would allow me to do that. And I ended up with something called Adobe Fresco, which is essentially like an easier version of Adobe Illustrator. Um, and I just kind of started to play around with it, and I realized that that specific software had features where I could change the coloring of the fragment, meaning that anything that the software read as, being of a red hue or yellow hue, that type of thing, and kind of play with contrasts and differences that way. Because the thing is, most likely these tapestries have been extremely colorful, but the colors are gone. They've
Right.
you know they've faded or been leached out of them for some reason, which often happens with stuff that is literally buried for 1,000 years. And they're kind of hard to look at with the naked eye and just be like, what am I looking at? So, long story short, that morphed into me 3 years later sitting here with my iPad now. I've upgraded to an iPad. and literally like drawing on it, just being like, what is happening?
Hmm.
So I do what I call like an etch-a-sketch process where I try to change the coloring to see how I can make like the most contrasts be visible without blowing out the image. And then literally just coloring in what I see and trying to differentiate between, okay, what are warps? So meaning like I would call them like in quotation mark background threads. So the original threads that are there that aren't necessarily indicators of a motif. But then like, okay, so what are warps and what are wefts and okay. And then coloring in and sometimes I get really good results. And then sometimes I'm sitting there trying very hard not to pull my hair out because I'm annoyed. But it's a lot of fun. So I color in what I can see. I usually try to use two contrasting colors to kind of differentiate between um different shades. So like when I talk about like changing the coloring of the fabric, they're not I'm not talking about actual colors, just what the
Right.
software kind of reads as a specific hue or specific colors. So I try to I think I actually when I kind of gave you a sneak peek of my work, I forgot to specify, but the colorings that I use are absolutely in no way, shape, or form authentically like Viking Age colors. It is just me going, what am I looking at? Um, they probably would have been very colorful, but what colors were used where, we don't know, which is also it's a bit of a tough process to try to figure that out because in order to do that, you need to do dye analyses. And for the most part, those analyses are pretty invasive, which means that you need to
Hmm.
take a piece of the fabric and destroy it to chemically analyze what remains, like what plant remains or dye remains are there to try to figure out what color it would be. And that's something like, okay, which parts of the tapestries do we sacrifice? Like,
Oof.
Yeah.
how do we do that?
No
Luckily, I'm
kidding.
not involved with that, so I don't know how they do it, but they're amazing. The people who work on this, so credit be them for figuring that out. But the colors that I use are just for my own benefit to try to analyze what I'm looking at. And then after I've colored in, I usually use those colored layers. I make them more transparent and I kind of have them on top of the image of the the original image of the fragment. Um, and I use the colors as kind of a baseline for trying to figure out, are there any motifs here? If so, like, what do they look like? Where does this thread go? Is it just a loose thread? Is it an indicator of an outline? Is it like, yeah,
And
Wow, that
speaking of
sounds really
motifs,
hard.
it
Oh,
does. It
it
really
is.
does.
I mean, I'm not gonna lie, it is.
you are earning that PhD.
Yes,
Thank
you
you.
are.
It's very sweet of you because
Seems seems above and beyond to me.
Yeah.
I'm looking at it's the funniest thing to me is the fact that I did not see this coming. This is very much like it happened organically and I played around with it and I was talking to a colleague of mine a few years ago and I was kind of just getting into this and I was kind of explaining my process and she looked at me and she just went, "Do you mean to tell me that you've like made a new method?" And I was like, "Nah, I don't think so." And she was like, "Well, have anyone done this before?" I was like, "I don't think so." And she was like, "So you've made a method?" I was like, "Oh, well, when you put it like that."
Wow. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Which is pretty cool. I have a hard time tooting my own horn, but right here, I want to toot my own horn a little bit because
Yeah, you should.
it's pretty cool. And
It
I'm
is
also
very cool.
I want to tell your listeners that I'm very excited to share stuff when it's ready to be published. Unfortunately, I have to be a bit careful with what I share. When I do sometimes share stuff on my social media, but not very often. But I'm very excited to show this stuff off because I think it's really interesting to be able to present just a um not I wouldn't necessarily say different interpret well, it is a different interpretation than the drawings that we already have, but it's not necessarily that I purposefully make it different. It's just that I am another person using other tools So Sophie Kraft and Mary Storm, who previously illustrated a lot of these fabrics and also did like just the shading in their drawings is just obnoxiously good. When I like compare my stuff, I'm like, ugh. But they were like sat with the fabric next to them, and I assume like maybe a magnifying glass or something, and then sketching paper. And that's what they had. Well, I'm able to put this on a digital screen. I'm able to change contrasts and lighting, and I'm able to like zoom in and out. And I have other like the models that I talked about earlier that I can use as kind of helpful tools if I'm like having a hard time figuring out one piece of one fabric. Like, oh, well, will the RTI model help me out, kind of interpreting what I'm looking at? What's happening here? So I think it's really interesting to and really fun and such a privilege to be able to add another perspective to these tapestries because I think it is an extremely subjective thing to interpret art and interpret anything really. But then sitting there and actually drawing something really it's almost impossible to not reflect on the fact that this is subjective.
Yes,
So,
absolutely.
not to say
Wow.
that I think that my sketches are wrong, because I
Right.
don't, but I know that in some cases, like a couple of the fragments I was working on today, I was like, oh man, people might really drag me for this, but honestly, I'm just trying to figure out what I'm looking at here, but this one is really tough.
Yeah.
And
Well,
and
all
so the
scholarship is subjective, even when
Exactly.
they
yeah,
excavate something, as we learned with BJ 581, when sometimes it can be wrong. It's a subjective.
100%.
absolutely.
100%.
So, do you want to tell our listeners where they can find you? Is there a good place on social media, and if you give updates on what you're working on or anything?
Yeah. I could like I don't necessarily update that often. But I do have a few tidbits online. So if you want to check out the little that I have kind of snuck out there on the interwebs, you could always find me on Instagram at archaeomags, and that's archaeo with a K. And I'm also a co-host of the Nordic Mythology podcast that you can find on Instagram and anywhere you get your podcasts, if that's okay that I plug
Oh, of
that.
course, yes. I love the Nordic Mythology podcast. I think it's great. So,
I also wanted to extend um, Dan's wishes, and he says hi, and you're
oh,
also very welcome to come on to our podcast at any time if you guys would want, of course.
oh, hey, that would be fun.
Yeah.
I might take you up on that. Well, thank you so much for coming on. We're so excited about what you're up to, and we look forward to hearing from you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. This was
All
so much
right.
fun.
It was. All right.
It's a blast.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening. You can find Johanna at johannawittenberg.com, where you'll find a free short story, a prequel to her Norse Queen series. And you can find me, KS, at ksbarton.com, where you can also find a free short story from me, a prequel to my Norse family series. See you next time.